So something that we talked about, I don't know, a couple of meetings ago, was I had forgotten that Valentino Braitenberg was a neuroanatomist, um, in before he did the book Vehicles. So the whole book Vehicles is a book about toy models of nervous systems, and he uses the vehicle metaphor because it's this thing that does something, it provides a function. And so, like a vehicle, if you think about a vehicle as like this autonomous thing, it has a brain and it moves and it has different movements towards things in its environment. And so, throughout the book Vehicles, Bradenberg talks about these different designs, but critically on the different wirings inside the vehicles, from sensor to effector. So, the sensors being the things that take in information from the environment, the effectors are the things that move the vehicle through the environment. And so the way it's approached looks very much like some sort of very simple neuroanatomy, but it also resembles cybernetics and cybernetic control. It's interesting how, it's not mentioned as an instance of cybernetics, at least as a primary example, but it is, and it provides this framework for thinking about autonomous agents, embodied agents, but also has connections in neuroanatomy and thinking about those kinds of problems. So this is an article from Biological Cybernetics. It's a journal. It's from 2014, and the title is Structural Aspects of Biological Cybernetics, Valentino Braitenberg, Neuroanatomy, and Brain Function. So this is a picture of Valentino Braitenberg. So they say the best way of introducing Valentino Braitenberg is by quoting one of his distinctive arguments. So the quote is here: when a new science emerges every couple of centuries, those who are privileged enough to witness it from its very beginnings to its full development during the span of their own lifetime can indeed count themselves lucky. My colleagues and I, who became fully fledged after World War II, had precisely this privilege. The science to which I am referring to still has no proper name, but its existence can be testified to by the matter of course, the way in which physicists, biologists, and logicians discuss issues that do not fall into any of the categories of physics, biology, or logic. Their consensus is not so much interdisciplinary, which does not bring much more than admiration from people who don't know much about it, as decided neo-disciplinary. What does that mean? Neo-disciplinary is something that's based on a new language and terminology that convinces all sides and that is already so well established that it hardly needs to be discussed any further. That's interesting. So it's based on some new language or terminology, and it's so well established that it hardly needs to be discussed any further. So it gives an example here. Some call this new discipline informatics, others information science. It may sometimes be narrowed down to neuroinformatics or technical informatics. So this is, of course, thinking about information science. Informatics kind of grew out of a number of disciplines, like cognitive science and like cybernetics. And you have informatics departments where people come from all different disciplines and they do things like data science and computing and things like that. So but I don't know if I would necessarily connect that with neo-disciplinary is the way he defines it. But anyways, then he goes on to say the term cybernetics, which does not meet with universal approval, has nonetheless a good chance of asserting itself in the long run. So this is probably not true because we don't really talk about cybernetics as much as we talk about informatics these days. This is not least due to the fact that the term was coined by its most brilliant founder, the mathematician Erwin Wiener. His solid philosophical and philological background is reflected in the fitting name that he gave to this science. The designation cognitive science, which is currently popular, might well one day apply to everything that we still refer to as informatics and cybernetics. Maybe that. I mean, there's some aspects of cognitive science that kind of fold in on those fields. But then again, the plain and rather sloppy term computer science might come up, and at the end of the day might be more appropriate. As a tribute, if you like, to the fact that the whole thing did not get off the ground until large electronic data processors were invented. Yet one thing is for sure, this new area that has arisen between the humanities and natural sciences, while not professing to belong to either discipline, actually succeeds in querying the boundaries of both. Although no one can be universally knowledgeable, there is no longer a wall to prevent us from taking a peek to see what is on the other side. Okay, so this was actually in 1999. So there was some sort of at the beginning of what we might call modern informatics. There was of course, informatics really kind of took off in the 90s, but we've had 25 years or so since then to sort of get to see that sort of the realistic nature of his predictions. I'm not sure if they all kind of panned out, but okay. But anyways, he goes through kind of how he described the science to which journal was dedicated to and which he was committed to his own research. The books by Wiener and Shannon and Weaver hit him, the prospective brain scientist, like a thunderbolt. So he's talking about the mathematical theory of communication and then Norbert Wiener's introduction to cybernetics, I believe. So these were books that, as a brain scientist, he kind of took inspiration from them. And in fact, I think a lot of early cognitive science was like that, where people were reading these books that were coming out at the time, out of cybernetics, out of that camp, and applying it to brain science and coming up with something new. And then, that's not exactly what cognitive science is, of course. We've talked about the cognitive science hexagon, but a lot of the inspiration for sort of the computational aspect of cognitive science kind of came out of that sort of school of thought. Educated as a psychiatrist and neurologist in Rome up to 1954, Valentino Braitenberg was driven by the wish to understand the neurobiological mechanisms underlying behavior. So again, an organism produces behavior, you want to know what underlies that behavior. It takes you to neuroanatomy, but ultimately it takes you to information processing because you want to know how that information that goes in one end comes out the other end, which is sensor to effector, not digestion. Although, it's interesting because people who study, say, the digestive system, they weren't inspired by these same things. So it's kind of an interesting way that went. He was convinced that the study of brain structure and hence neuroanatomy in conjunction with brain theory is a tool to reach this goal. So this is, of course, thinking about brain theory and brain structure and how those things explain the generation behavior. Research days took him to the neuroanatomists Oscar Vogt and Karl Kleist in Germany, and later to Yale Medical School in New Haven, where he made the acquaintance of the protagonists of cybernetics, Wiener, McCullough, and von Forrester. So he actually met the cybernetics kingpins, I guess, so that was kind of interesting. He had that interaction. So we went back to Italy eventually. He obtained his habilitation in 1963 in the disciplines cybernetics and information theory, and became the director of the Department of Biocybernetics at University of Naples. In 1968, at the suggestion of Werner Reichart, and together with Karl Gotz and Kuno Kirschfeld, he was appointed to be one of the co-founding directors of the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Germany. Other appointments were that of honorary professor at the Faculty of Physics
at the University of Tübingen and the Faculty of Biology at the nearby University of Freiburg. So this was an article from a special issue of Biological Cybernetics, and so I guess he died in 2011. So this was published in 2014. He died in 2011, and his work continues to have a strong influence on modern brain science. Starting from his clinical experience as a psychiatrist, he committed himself to the investigation of connectivity schemes in the brain and of their respective roles for brain function. The focus of his attention was on the visual system of the fly, the cerebral and cerebellar cortex of vertebrates, and their role in perception, memory, movement, and language. It led to seminal contributions in all these various fields. Moreover, he was a master in bridging the gap between the humanities and the natural sciences, which is evident from most of his books. His mastery also characterized his lectures and seminars, spanning a wide range of themes related to the brain, from neuroanatomy and neurophysiology via automata theory. So this is the stuff that he did with Braitenberg vehicles, information theory and logic through to clinical topics, to language and music, never remaining superficial, but providing a participant with the practical tools to contribute constructive ideas to open questions, a fascinating remaining source of inspiration for many. And then in this foreword, we give Valentino Braitenberg not only the first but also the last word by reprinting at the end of his fascinating Manifesto for Brain Science, first published in 1992, but having lost nothing of its sparkling actuality till the present day. So this is great. This is kind of a really deep dive into Braitenberg's work and how it connects with cybernetics. So he really was connected to this new phase in neuroscience beginning in the 1950s, which was the resurrection of neuroanatomy. So once Ramon y Cajal published a lot of his work and Lorente de No published a lot of their work, this was this was kind of where neurons were first mapped out, neural networks in the brain were first mapped out, and they were drawn by hand. And then, of course, you have that information, right? And there's not a lot of work that's being done after that until the 1950s. And then, of course, you had to wait for things like being able to have diffusible substances and other types of signals in brain circuits that you can visualize them and see the flow of electrical signals and information and all of that. So that's what they're kind of waiting for in a sense, but also, it was also kind of thinking about theoretical questions and how neuroanatomy can influence that. So Braitenberg actually almost single-handedly made neuroanatomy into a pillar of brain theory, for providing examples of a direct translation of neural structure into functional schemes that had not yet emerged from the then prevalent method of neurophysiology. So neurophysiology was chugging along, and it wasn't necessarily answering the same questions. So bringing neuroanatomy back into the fold was an important point, and it had a lot of theoretical sort of implications. His impact on modern brain science is comparable to that of founders of neurocybernetics, who introduced around the same time the logical analysis of nervous nets. So that was, of course, the McCullough and Pitts work published in 1943. The concept of feedback and homeostatic mechanisms, that was Wiener in 1948. Concepts of information and redundancy and perception, that was Shannon in 1948. And the neural theory of associative learning and cell assemblies, that was Hebb in 1949. So we had these neurophysiological units, we had cybernetic feedback, we had information theory, and then we had Hebbian learning, or associative learning, or the models that Hebb introduced for associative learning, all within about
7 years. So it's interesting that those things kind of all happened at the same time, and then that inspired Braitenberg to work on to connect that with neuroanatomy, and then make all these discoveries aside from his Braitenberg vehicles, although he did that as well. So his discoveries were numerous. One thing he discovered was the cerebellum, and this is a structure in the mammalian brain that is sort of down towards the base of the brain, and it's known as a timekeeping mechanism, or it has this temporal aspect to cognition, and so he discovered that the cerebellum was a millisecond clock. So Braitenberg's early work on the cerebellum presented the first example of a neuroanatomical morphology, interpreted in terms of its function down to the level of individual neurons and synapses. His conclusion that the cerebellum is specialized for the measurement of time intervals with a precision of better than 1 millisecond has become common knowledge, even if not undisputed. The later versions of his model continue to provide inspiring explanations of the role of the cerebellum in motor control. The second one is the exact neural wiring in insects. His work on the visual ganglia of insects, originally inspired by behavioral analysis of Werner Reichart and his group in Tübingen, led to the first completed and undisputed explanation of the intricate structure of a neuronal network, that of the fibers connecting the fly's eye to the visual ganglia. His neuroanatomical analysis provided the proof, in parallel to Trujillo-Sinno's and Melamed, for the neuronal superposition eye, predicted by Kirschfeld. So the principle involves assigns of a precise origin and destination to every fiber of the network, and was shown to hold with unerring precision. So this is where in mammalian brains, usually you have different pathways that can emerge. In insects, you have these precise pathways from cell to cell. You see this in C. elegans as well, with circuits, where you have these precise sort of origins and destinations for every connection or every fiber in a network. So this is interesting. Apart from its importance for visual physiology, the finding was of great importance for developmental neurobiology, as it showed the precision to which genetically pre-programmed networks could be expressed and ultimately implemented. So in development, you have the brain gets laid out in a certain way, and it's always kind of very similar between organisms. And then, say, you'd have to ask, well, why does that happen? Is this just chemical signaling, or is there a genetic component? So they kind of work that out in that area of work. The cerebral cortex is an associative memory. So this is where Braitenberg looked at the structure and function of the cerebral cortex. And he has this book, Anatomy of the Cortex, which summarizes the results of many years of painstaking experimental work. It proposes a view of the cortex quite different from the traditional one, and that the essence of its wiring seems to support the principle of a great mixing machine, where all data are maximally dispersed so that the convergence of a large as possible of a sample cortical activity is guaranteed to impinge on any one small region of cortex. So this is kind of like maybe, in a lot of ways, maybe the precursors to connectionism, because it shows in that kind of model of cortex, you have this network, and it's sort of an all-to-all network, and you can basically take, signals from large areas of the cerebral cortex and focus it down to one small area, because it mixes everything up, and it basically churns data everywhere in that structure, and it maximally disperses data so it can converge in different areas. So it's really an interesting concept. I think it's interesting in light, of course, what would become neural networks and connectionism. So
yeah, we should put a kind of a pin in that and think about it a little bit. The high degree of divergence and convergence, together with the finding that most synapses in the cortex are weak, excitatory, and modifiable, strongly endorse the idea that the cortex specializes in embodying memories in the form of cell assemblies, and that goes back to Hebb. Meanwhile, there is a remarkable convergence and hence reciprocal confirmation between the anatomical findings of Braitenberg and his associates and the physiological results of various groups around the world. And so then he made a number of other contributions to related fields, such as motor control, visual physiology, information, perception, language, logic and philosophy, behavior and artificial intelligence. So all of those areas were kind of his contributions. Some of the contributions came in the form of the book Vehicles, and this is described as an unconventional yet highly effective introduction to the problems of artificial intelligence. So this is part of a special issue, so they give some kind of discussion of some papers of the special issue here, and kind of growing out of his work. There's also this Manifesto of Brain Science. So this is like, I don't know how many points we have here. 10 points? Yeah. So I'll go through that really quickly. So this is Valentino Braitenberg's Manifesto of Brain Science. So he breaks this down to 10 points. One, we believe that there are questions of such philosophical import that they deserve being pursued without any consideration of utility. One of them refers to the nature of thought processes, or more generally of complex behavior. So he was thinking about the complexity of thought and cognition during his career. Number two, we are convinced that ultimately a satisfactory explanation of thought and behavior will be given in a language akin to that of physics in mathematical terms. So he was a strong believer in mathematizing behavior and, of course, thinking and cognition. Number three, the physics of living organisms with its specialized branches of physiology and biochemistry will be undoubtedly the basis for such an explanation, but it will not be sufficient by itself as a theory of behavior. In fact, when boiled down to physical fundamentals, a mouse or even a worm is not very different from man. We are ultimately interested in thought and behavior of people, not of worms. So this kind of talks about this. I don't know when this came with respect to C. elegans being established as a model organism, but definitely thinking about C. elegans and how that relates to human cognition, human neurophysiology. And then four, the difference in behavior in different species reflect different ways of coping with the environment or the distinct niches of the environment. These different behaviors have their material counterpart in different brains. Therefore, the peculiar nature of any animal brain cannot be explained from their physical components alone. The explanation necessarily involves causes residing outside the animal, information deriving from the environment. So this is an information-based explanation, but also an environmental-based explanation. Number five, concepts such as Shannonian information, which is, of course, Claude Shannon's information theory, which became the standard definition of information, but is by no means the only definition of information, even mathematically speaking. Coding, computation are outside of physics, even if the formulas look like physics. Indeed, Shannon's information is very analogous to thermodynamics and the formulations provided by Boltzmann, but they're outside of physics somehow. I guess it's because it's about information as a structure, and it doesn't really describe entropy, even though sometimes people describe it as information entropy. But anyways, but his point here is that they are central to brain science.
So you think about like Shannon information and coding. There are a lot of coding uh, theories and methods and techniques for looking at how signals are encoded. And then there's also, of course, computational neuroscience. Those are all central to brain science. Those are kind of at least central to early, like maybe mid-century brain science and thinking about how information processing occurs. And then, of course, this is linked to electronics and computer science. This is the basis for a lively discourse between certain branches of engineering and brain science. I think that's kind of the whole basis of, where we came from with neural networks. So, there were, of course, in early cognitive science, in that cognitive science hexagon, we have computer science. Sometimes people put electrical engineering in there. And then, of course, we put psychology and maybe sometimes neuroanatomy, although it's largely a dialogue between psychology and computer science. But it's interesting how he kind of brings up some of these points that aren't in the cognitive science hexagon. Another common aspect is that both deal with functions directed to a goal, which physics does not. So he makes that distinction about teleology, where you have functions, goal-directed functions, that are distinct from physics. So putting that together, we're talking about Shannon information. We're talking about how it's not physics, but it's central to understanding how the brain processes information. And then that there's this goal-directedness that makes it kind of separate from physics. And that kind of is put together theoretically to describe neural information processing. Number 6, our object being the discovery of computer-like operations in brains. So he's definitely a neurocomputationist. And we talked about that a while back with our discussions about, is the brain a computer? And we have those videos up on our YouTube channel, and it was a really interesting conversation. I never thought to bring Valentino Braitenberg into the mix, but anyways, he had some thoughts on this. And his thoughts were that this is something we should pursue. The hypotheses we test in our experiments are really inventions of computing schemes, and therefore are necessarily more complex than the hypotheses in other branches of science. Thus, we are inventors of computing devices, much as our colleagues in artificial intelligence are, and we can learn from them as much as they can learn from us. This is this whole basis of the neuro AI debate that they have about, well, what can computer scientists learn from neuroscience and vice versa. And, it's usually a pretty trivial conversation about applications, but, this is something that we can think about theoretically as well. Number 7, computation in brains is a fine-grained operation requiring a spatial resolution of about 1 to 10 micrometers. So this is where thinking about, like, if brains are doing computing, they're doing this at a very small scale, much like computers do, where, you have logic gates that are very small. And in fact, in modern, as we get smaller and smaller chips, as logic gates get tinier and tinier. And so we're dealing with spatial resolution of about 1 to 10 micrometers. So that's pretty small. The functional elements are fibers and neurons, and in most cases, many neurons are involved in significant functional patterns. This requires special techniques of observation, which are being developed: multiple electron recording, optical recording by means of voltage-sensitive dyes. In most cases, the vast amount of information produced by these recording techniques can only be stored and digested by means of large computers. So he's, again, making that connection between digital computers and neural computers. Very popular at that time to think about that, sort of those analogies down to the level of like the specific technologies and specific things going on in the brain. Number 8, we believe that the distribution of electrical signals observed at a spatial resolution of 1 micron and a temporal resolution of about 1 millisecond, is all we need to know as a material counterpart of behavior. So we really just need to have this sort of specific spatial and temporal resolution in each neuron or in each unit of the brain to understand the generation of behavior. Behavior may be modified by hormones or by pharmaca, but only or by pathological imbalance or some neurotransmitter substance. But the actual effect of these is always expressed in terms of the occurrence or non-occurrence of action potentials in neurons. So if he's an action potential first person, he doesn't care about some of the modifiers of behavior. The model is like action potentials at the scale of 1 micron by 1 millisecond, and then adding those up or finding the emergent properties of those to describe behavior. A more fine-grained analysis, say at the molecular level, is relevant for the understanding of the individual cell, but probably unnecessary for understanding of behavior, or may even obscure the picture there. So again, it's not that he's a reductionist so much, it's that he's picked out a specific unit of analysis he finds that's most important. The modifiers are sort of maybe adding in noise that you don't need. Now, that one could argue that that's not necessarily the case, but this is really the logic that goes into modern neural networks, because we're kind of use that sort of abstraction as a way to describe like the units of a network, and then those things are networked together. So it's worth thinking that maybe he's wrong on that point. Maybe there are other things going on in the cell. Maybe there are other things that are going on in neural systems that actually do play enough of a role to modify. Well, of course it modifies it, but it's how do those relations affect the occurrence of action potentials, but also information processing. Number 9, developmental neurobiology is a branch of general biology, not a brain science as defined here. How do the fibers from the eye find their way to the optic tectum? So this is a common issue in neurodevelopment where the eye is forming, it's making its connection to the brain through the optic tectum. The answer to this question will tell us much about how the arteries find their way into the kidney or the roots of a tree into the earth, but very little about the problem of the analysis of visual information in the optic tectum. So he actually doesn't think development is particularly relevant to brain science in the sense of information processing. What's important is kind of the information processing as it stands once that pathway gets established, not as a function of that pathway being established. Or I should say rather that pathway, if it's established in different or aberrant ways, can have an effect on information processing. But the process of developmental generation and that whole thing is not relevant to information processing. So it's an interesting distinction, and that's something, if we're doing developmental Braitenberg vehicles, that's something to kind of consider answering in some way. And I have some answers for that, but I'm not going to share them right now. Let's just say that I don't necessarily agree with this point. Okay, so 10, efficient research groups in brain science are small. Everybody is groping for experimental techniques and for conceptual models. If someone draws up a gigantic project in order to solve the problem by brute force, he is likely to have missed the complexity of the situation and is sure to produce much waste. So it's interesting that he doesn't believe in huge interdisciplinary research projects necessarily. He believes in these kind of small brain-oriented projects, or maybe small interdisciplinary projects. I don't know. I kind of agree that like some of these very large research groups sort of have more heat than light in a lot of ways. I mean, they publish these huge papers that kind of overwhelm the field with data, but what are they really discovering in those groups? Is it like worth all of the, all of the hype? I don't know. I mean, small research groups have a role to play as well. I guess that's the point, is that the most efficient research groups are probably smaller. But, that depends on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to map the brain, or are you trying to simulate the brain, or are you trying to answer specific questions? To illustrate my points, I want to mention some successes of modern brain science in its interaction with information engineering. So he makes a couple of points here. The first is the paper by McCullough and Pitts proposed an equivalence between nets of neurons connected by synapses and propositions of Boolean logics. The terminology and the diagrams of this paper were immediately taken over by the designers of calculating machines such as John von Neumann, and the basic ideas became the starting point for more than one theoretical development. So this is both automata theory, which we're familiar with from Braitenberg vehicles, and also from modern computer science models, discrete models, and Chomskyan linguistics, which is interesting. B is that some ideas were exchanged repeatedly to and for between brain science and engineering. The idea of the perceptron that was introduced by Rosenblatt, randomly connected image processor, was inspired by neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. It has admirable technological consequences even today. And this is a paper by Terry Sejnowski in 1987. It received criticism on theoretical grounds by Minsky and Selfridge, who thought that a machine equipped with preset form detectors, which is the pandemonium network that was proposed back then, would be much more efficient. So this is an interesting piece of work, the pandemonium machine. This is basically something that inspired neurophysiological work. So pandemonium was kind of a neural network that had different layers, and the layers had different it was almost like a Braitenberg vehicle. I'll have to bring it into the meeting at some point, but it was quite an interesting model. The early model, it didn't really pan out, at least in terms of technologies, but it's an interesting approach. And this is not an embodied network. This is actually resembling kind of like a modern neural network or deep learning network. In any case, this inspired work by Letvin and others, which turned into the seminal paper, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, and that was published in 1959. So this model pandemonium inspired this model of behavior where you, basically in the frog, what happens is you have this connection between the eye, the visual system, and the tongue that goes out and captures flies. And there has to be this tight connection between sensory and motor streams. And what happens is you can take the frog's eye and you can do a surgery where you rotate it 90 degrees. And if you rotate the eye 90 degrees, the frog can no longer align its tongue with the target that it's trying to get to. So whereas the normal frog would be able to capture a fly with its tongue and make that calculation of that angle that needs to project its tongue, if you rotate the eye 90 degrees, the frog's tongue is off of the target by 90 degrees. And it's just suggesting that there's this sort of spatial framework, or this spatial schema that it uses to make this mapping. And that if you modify the anatomy, you also modify the behavior by offsetting that schema by 90 degrees. So it's really interesting. That's a famous paper. It's interesting work. Parallel to it, in the same intellectual environment, work on the cat and monkey visual cortex in the hands of Hubel and Wiesel produced splendid Nobel Prize-winning results. The Hubel and Wiesel feature detectors in turn gave engineers ideas, which produced several efficient image processing devices. So this is theory informing technology, theory informing experiments. C, filter theory, auto and cross correlation, generalized Fourier analysis. These are all theoretical concepts developed in electronics.
Reichard describes the results of his and Hassenstein's experiments on optomotor reactions in insects in terms of basically what was signal processing. So having, all of these tools available to use not only as mathematical tools but metaphors was important for some of these advances in neuroscience. This was the first model of an animal behavior which made detailed predictions on the neurological wiring underlying the behavior, and the predictions were in part confirmed anatomically. The technological fallout was a patent for a device designed to measure the direction and velocity of a moving panorama. And then D, associative memory, was postulated by psychologists such as Hebb. Well, he wrote the initial paper on it, and then people elaborated on it later, as a principle underlying cognition and behavior. This idea turned into a variety of mathematical models, one of which, the neural net of the Hopfield kind, is hailed now as the cornerstone of a new age of computing technology. It was shown that the statistics of connections within the cerebral cortex, and this is a paper Braitenberg and Schutz in 1991, best be explained as being specialized for associative memory. So there's a statistical study that they did within cerebral cortex and kind of getting this connection to being sort of evolved for associative memory and showing the evidence for that. The global states of activity which the Hopfield theory postulates, a sort of resonant modes or eigenstates of the cortex, has been shown with computer analysis of multiple electrode recordings. So really interesting stuff from about Valentino Braitenberg, and I like to revisit that because history is always good to see where we've been and see what some of these intellectual connections are.